Hello everyone, and welcome to another video in the Engaging with Art series. This is part 2 of our exploration of color, and today we are specifically discussing the emotional capacity of color. When I say emotional capacity, I specifically mean the ability color has to be used emotionally in the context of art. The emotional aspect of color and its effect emotionally is one of the major aspects of my work in particular. So that's what makes this topic so pungent for me, so specific and so personal. With that in mind, and certainly as I always say, this is a very speculative approach to color and its emotional abilities because I just want to share my ideas, my thoughts, and the experience that I have as a viewer and how that plays into my work in order to help you sort of have just a more thoughtful approach to how color may be used emotionally when you're viewing art. I'd like to start off too by suggesting two artists that I really admire and who are really important to me when it comes to utilizing color. And those two are Josef Albers and Mark Rothko. Now, I love these artists as a viewer and fellow artist of them, but by no means as an expert. So really my appreciation for them has just simply come from just basic study and understanding, and by no means have I really exhausted all of the possibilities when it comes to understanding these artists or their work. Josef Albers was very famous for his study of the interaction of color, and as a matter of fact, his book titled Interaction of Color is one I would highly suggest reading, and it's one that I actually have read myself. He was very much interested in the materiality of color's capacity when we're placing them juxtaposed to one another. What do certain colors do when placed up against one another? How do those interactions affect our perception of them, as well as what they visually sort of create when viewed? So a lot of Josef Albers' work is done compositionally when it comes to color. But for me as the viewer, I always see the combinations of colors as he's putting together and the relationships that he's forming with these colors, despite the fact that they are oftentimes done in a concrete sense. I find they have a lot of emotional weight to them, and I think that's what excites me about his work so much. His work is also sometimes associated with what are known as the hard edge painters, and that's because the way that he would actually compose his compositions is quite literally using very strict blocks of color that are rendered with very straight, rigid lines in order that the relationships of them juxtaposed are very one-to-one. Mark Rothko, on the other hand, was known for his color field paintings. He would basically create these very large, very large canvases that had usually two, maybe one, maybe more than two colors just placed next to each other in very large swaths. And Rothko wanted his viewers to have a profound emotional experience when they viewed these large canvases. If you've never had the chance, I would highly recommend seeing one in person. I've had the opportunity to see one, and it's truly a remarkable experience. It really is. And that's honestly what his goal was. His goal was very much to evoke something very specific in his viewers through these colors and their juxtaposition. And so that's what resonates so deeply with me with regards to Mark Rothko. We have two very different artists, but both are using color in very interesting ways. Josef Albers is using the materiality aspect and the complementarity, the color wheel relationships, to demonstrate the effects that certain colors have together. And then Rothko is sort of taking it the step further to say, these are the colors that will evoke certain experiences. And it's kind of where I want to lead in from that, because again, that's what I really resonate with, is color's ability to evoke something within us emotionally. I just want to speak in broad strokes first off to say that some artists will employ color emotionally and others will not. In part 1 of the color video series, we discuss symbolism and how some artists will use color symbolically and some will not. And likewise for emotion, and I think that's another aspect to consider as well. For me, this contributes to the expressionist aspect of my work, because I describe it as neo-figurative and neo-expressionism sort of coming together. And the expressionist quality of my work, expressionism as a whole, is a school of thought or an artistic style, however you want to call it, that utilizes color in a way that is done through the emotional impulse, that it's being used very deliberately for the way that it's making the artist feel and the way that it's making the viewer potentially feel. Sometimes when artists aren't using color, there is also a deliberate emotional aspect to that too. Think of something that's done in complete monochrome, something that's done in complete black and white. Artists sometimes will deliberately do that, and that also has an emotional capacity too. It's very interesting, right? It's like color's absence is somehow also an emotional potentiality for color. And lastly, I think it's important to remember too that some artists will have more precise ideas of color, whereas others will use it more intuitively. I think we can understand that when it comes to emotions in general, how they come and go, how they can be very violent and turbulent in different ways because of different things going on, circumstances. And so I think that's something to recall as well that's very, very important, where artists are not always going to be very precise about the emotions they're trying to evoke. And sometimes it might be broad, sometimes it might be more specific. And these are things we need to consider and try to find and discover with art too. As viewers, we need to also recall the associations that we make with colors and how that's going to play a major part in the emotional experience we have and that response that we have. I think there are definitely universal ones. I think naturally we would associate warmth, oranges, yellows with, say, the sun, with maybe a brightness, with maybe an emotional experience of joy or just a peaceful summer. Or we might experience blue as more peaceful because we're thinking of the association with water, with the ocean. These are very general associations that translate pretty well. But then we're also going to have very personal ones too. Think about the way that certain moments in our lives can be sometimes associated with certain colors. I think certain traumatic events, say a car wreck, for example, forgive me if that's kind of too traumatic of an experience for some folks, but if you have certain colors that were associated with that wreck, say, I don't know, like the black of the tire marks in the asphalt or something, or even unfortunately, if there was a fire associated with it, some people may then carry that negative association with those colors, with the oranges, with the reds through their lives. And that's going to, again, impact the way that they emotionally connect with those values when seen depicted in artwork. We have our own memories, our experiences, and our circumstances that are also going to impact how we appreciate certain colors. And obviously, think of just the nature of a favorite color, something that for you just elicits something joyful, something peaceful, whereas with others, it's not going to necessarily carry that same weight. We, as viewers, are bringing something to an artwork when it comes to the colors that we behold, and the artist visually is also bringing certain aspects to that as well. And so there's a very dynamic intermingling of a lot of emotions and a lot of different ideas going on. In order to exemplify this, I think, a little bit more specifically, and as I usually do, I want to discuss my own work because, as I'd mentioned, the emotional capacity of color is incredibly important for me and it's utilized regularly in my practice. And as I was just saying, I think my own associations naturally feed into my utilization of color emotionally and how I employ them. And I think it shifts from time to time. One example is the 21st Century Royalty series, where all of the figures are created in this value that I've sort of described as computer blue. It's a buildup of 3 layers. It starts with light cerulean at the base, then cerulean blue over top, and then it ends with indanthrone blue for the actual depth and contrast. The reason behind that, the concept of computer blue, is because of that blue screen of death that we can associate with like the Windows operating system, where when you behold it, it means something traumatic has happened to the computer. And I wanted that to feed into this idea of 21st Century Royalty because that series is looking at individuals that we sort of idolize and worship in the 21st century that are somehow related or similar to the reverence that subjects would afford royal portraiture of old in the days of monarchies. Visually, when you behold that color, the figure in a blue like that appears suffocated or drowned. And so it adds that sort of desolate emotional quality to the figure too, and it makes it more sullen. Blue has always just been a color for me that's very strong, and it's a color that I kind of find respite in, I find reprieve in. It feels very safe and always has for me, and that's another reason why it appears, I think, often in my work across the gambit. A more broad example that's not really specific to a series is jade green. For some reason, jade green has this like really mystical quality for me, and it feels very ethereal. And so it always just makes me emotionally feel very open and very wide, and it's sort of a very exciting and again just mysterious quality that washes over me, and that's why I love using that color as well. Because I utilize colored pencils, I actually have hard and fast names for all of the colors that I utilize, which is a very interesting and unique aspect to being a drawer as I am. I can point to certain colors by name and can form associations and relationships with those colors just by the fact I've used them for so long, or the way that they've been employed in my work, or the effects that they've had. I know very well in a lot of ways which colors I can go to for certain aspects, for certain emotional expectancies, potentialities, what have you. And obviously, I think it goes without saying that you're able to form deeper relationships when you can identify something by name. When you know something, it allows you to love it more. And so I also just think that that's an interesting aspect of having these names for my colors. Now, as I've been describing with just these two little examples, the jade green and computer blue aspect, I think these associations shift over time, and I recognize that as well. They shift over the course of my life. They're going to keep shifting over the course of circumstances and things that happen to me. And it's all a deeply subjective experience. What remains consistent in my work is the deep connection I have to color's emotional capacity, and the reason why I always want to use color. And my work is very conceptual, so it's important, I think, to always keep in mind that for me, even though I'm using color intuitively, even though I'm using it emotionally, it's done very deliberately, and I'm trying to evoke things. I'm trying to do things specifically in order to form a relationship with the viewer and the work. One little last example with my work I want to discuss is the last 5 years, because there's a very specific way I utilize the colors in each of those pieces where I'm looking at either harmony or dissonance. If I want more harmony, then I'm using colors that are going to cooperate visually better. It's going to create less tension, less friction. Kind of going back to Joseph Albers' idea. And then where if I want to create more tension in a piece, I'm going to be utilizing colors that are more uncomfortable when placed together or on top of each other or right alongside each other. And so with the last 5 years, I hope it comes across visually that these colors are being used to make us feel uncomfortable, make us feel stressed out, make us feel emotionally fatigued, or in some ways make us feel calm, make us feel peaceful, make us feel serene. Again, that's just one other example in my work of many more I could give of just how color is so powerful for me as an artist in order to evoke emotions in you as the viewer and to bring them out from inside of me. So I want to wrap things up here with just some things for you as the viewer. So what can you do now with this information, with these ideas? I think the first thing, like I said, think for yourself, what are the associations that I form with color emotionally? What are those colors that maybe evoke certain memories? Which ones are peaceful? Which ones are joyful? And then which ones are stressful or hard? Maybe even get out a piece of paper and just divide it down the middle and start writing little associations, like if there are colors that genuinely make you feel certain things in a positive direction, put them on one side. If there are colors that make you feel a certain way another way, put them on the left side where it's stressful, it's harder, it's more difficult or challenging. And maybe certain colors will do both in certain aspects. I think identifying these individually is going to help us understand why we're feeling certain things when we're viewing artwork using those particular colors. Another thing as a viewer we can do is find an artist who utilizes color emotionally and then start asking questions about how that artist is using those colors in that piece, and then in the context of, say, the larger body of work or across the artist's body of work in general, all of the work the artist has produced. Consider how the color is being used consistently. Are there clues within the work that suggest that there is emotional intent behind the employment of color? So that's something to look at, not just if an artist is using color emotionally, but if you aren't even sure, maybe there are other things going on in the work that might suggest something is happening. For example, if there's a figure and the figure is depicted in colors that aren't naturally associated with a human face, like for example, blue, if the figure is completely blue, What is the figure doing? Is there an emotional reaction on the figure's face? Is the figure disfigured? Are there things going on that could suggest that the blue is then also being used to further some emotional idea or concept? And as always, perhaps the title of a work is leaning into something. If there is a title that has a color's name in it, oftentimes we can use that as a clue to help us determine whether or not the color is being used in an emotional capacity within the work. So let that be something else that also informs your approach. And lastly, don't forget that your personal experience of a color and the artist's experience that artist is trying to convey with that color or bring about with that color creates a synergy, and that's great. There's a dynamism going on there. There's a lot happening that creates just something really magical. The idea is that something is evoked. The idea is that something is made to be felt within the viewer, made to be brought out of the artist onto the canvas. So don't eschew that notion. If you are feeling something, embrace it, because truly, I don't think there are necessarily wrong answers. Of course, I want to caution folks with their own associations that they don't want to get too place those upon the work itself too much. But again, I don't think there are wrong answers necessarily. This is artwork and it's a very subjective experience. Anytime emotions are involved, it's going to be subjective. And then especially when we're talking about color, it's going to be just as subjective as well. With that, I think I will wrap things up today. So thank you very much for watching. Please feel free to share this with anybody else who might find it worthwhile. And until the next one, take care, everybody.